Why don't we count both of them? We can change it from a gold standard to a gold exchange standard. So they basically doubled the money supply, and there went the boom of the 1920s and the real estate mania and Florida real estate that crowned it, just the same way it was going to do in the 1990s and also in the 1970s. We keep making the same stupid mistakes every single time, and I'm in the deepest sense of frustration that I've spent a business lifetime trying to stop this nonsense and have gotten absolutely nowhere. I have to say, Jim, that you are one of the few people that really understood my work early on and have promulgated and had the guts to actually publish it when almost nobody else in the press did. And I'm saying that Genoa conference, good luck trying to find anything out about it. It's been expunged from the textbooks, and some people come up with conspiracies that they need wars in order to take more control of the people. But whatever the reason, the truth is that these wars are a chance for government to take more control of the people's lives.
I want to talk about, and you address this in your book, where we are today. You have a chapter called The Gathering Storm. If you look at the money printing that the U.S. has done over the years, we sort of got away with it because we did it. It was as large as it is in terms of what we're seeing take place in this last crisis. It was a small percentage, and a gradual increase in inflation was sort of tolerated. But that's not the case today. If you take a look at the monetary base since the fall of 2008, if you take a look at government budget deficits, I never thought 10 years ago I would be looking at a country that was running $1.6 trillion in budget deficits, and today we had a press conference, and we're talking about a blue ribbon panel, but you know what? It'll probably be more talk than anything else.
That's a good point. The reason America got away with printing all this money, first of all, they had to sever the link with gold, and that was the original sin. The very function of gold is to limit the amount of paper that can be printed. And if you link gold to paper or silver to coins, for example, you cannot keep printing it and running deficits. And our leaders had to cut that link to get away with it. Now, the fascinating thing is, and you raise a good point, is they got away with it because the dollar had a reputation that it was as good as gold. Not everybody noticed that it was suddenly a gold exchange standard instead of a gold standard. This is right out of George Orwell. And they got away with it by printing just a small amount, just a few percent every year. But, of course, a 5% a year doubles the money supply every seventh year. And these things begin to add up. But the problem is politicians get greedy, and sooner or later it's 7% and 10% or more. And that's how I predicted on television and in 1996 that there would be a currency crisis in Asia. Some of the countries were printing 50% more currency every year. Well, that's the final stage. And so there was a currency crisis in 1997, 8, 9 in Southeast Asia. And I was on the Kanga show again, and they said, you had predicted this. Are you a clairvoyant? And I said, no, it's simple. You cannot print more money without consequences. If you could, why don't you double the money supply and give everybody $1 million? Money has to be related to true wealth creation. You cannot create jobs. You need to create wealth. So the goal these days to create jobs cannot work. And in terms of the deficits, not many people understand how much $1 trillion is. But I'll tell you this. If you spent $1 million a day, if you spent $1 million each and every day back to the time of the birth of Jesus, you could not spend $1 trillion. And the United States has a debt now of this decade of $9 trillion. And you can even go into the speed of light. A light year is, the distances are so vast, they've got to use the speed of light, which is the fastest thing in the universe we know about, and that is 6 trillion miles in 1 year. We are now approaching 2 light years of debt. And if you think that there's not going to be some terrible thing happening. You and I are in different planets.
You know, another issue that you brought up, and it's also creating some of the problems, and I was glad to see that you covered this in your book. On the macro scale, you saw a lot of nations cutting interest rates, cheapening their currency to aid their exports and inhibit imports. The U.S. did not play that game to the same extent, and what it did is we allowed foreign countries to come in here and grab a huge share of the American market. We hollowed out our industrial base, and even though our trade deficit has come down, it's still huge.
Yeah, that's something I've been raging about. In fact, we discussed this on your other shows that I've done with you. When you have a paper currency backed by nothing, they're basically, it's like an arm-linked bunch of staggering drunks. And when one falls, it drags down the others. There's nothing behind the currency. When you can print all you want, it becomes a tool. And what Japan did, for example, was very clever. Japan kept their interest rates down to nearly zero. And what that did, it made their currency less attractive against the dollar, which was paying 6%. In fact, there was a so-called carry trade, which is an abbreviation of an acronym for the carriage trade, how rich people made money. They borrowed money in Japan, paid almost nothing for it, and then bought U.S. Treasury bonds, making 6%. But when Japan did that, it was basically an act of currency war, I called it. And what they did was, by making their currency so cheap, it lowered their costs. So they could sell cars in America, and it would cost them a lot less. And I warned at that time that it was a fool's race to the bottom, that eventually all nations would be lowering their interest rates down to near zero. And then what happened is that they're all doing it now, and they can't lower it any further. Now they're at the end of the game, and there's nowhere to go. And meanwhile, there are terrible debts, and a deflation is stalking us. I'll tell you something. This currency war is pretty bad. And America, Bush finally let go and began to let the dollar plunge. And it's made the dollar more competitive. But even with that, we're still running at a trade deficit internationally. The function of money should be to make all goods transferable. That is one of the medium of exchange. Somebody makes carrots, grows carrots, the other one makes cars. They have a medium currency. They have a currency. They both can use it and trade in that currency. If one of them is cheating on the currency, which is a form of embezzlement actually, then the system will eventually break down because you're not getting an equal trade. Prices will be higher in one country than the other. And these imbalances have created a terrible problem because America has been disemboweled. Its industrial base is gone. I can't believe what was allowed to happen to General Motors. There are other reasons, granted. The idea that other countries could cheapen their currency, build a car, and even with the costs of shipping it across the Pacific Ocean, undercut America, should have been the signal. But, the government didn't care, and people like you and me were ignored, and now what? Well, now we don't have General Motors. A big automobile plant just closed here recently in Central California, and all the companies around it that fed it parts are all closed and going out of business. Storefronts are closing. You can't even recognize parts of California. You go down the main street, and the stores are shuttered. This country is out of business. In China, an engineer is paid $3,000 a month. And you know what? We cannot compete with that. America is out of business in that relationship. And that whole relationship with China has to be looked at in a very different way. They're following a mercantilist path of the government being the state. And the last chapter of the book was about China. I went to China in 1977. And just after Mao died, and everybody was saying it was the end of the world, terrible. But I wanted to see for myself. If you don't want to know, read. If you want to go, go. If you want to know, go. And I went there and came back with the most shocking prediction I've ever made. Well, one of the most shocking predictions I ever made, and I'm in the business of predictions. I said that China would dominate the 21st century. And 1/3 of my subscribers refused to renew. And they said, how could you be so stupid as to say China would outpace America when it's the poorest country in the world and America the richest? And you know what? That prediction still stands. And even today, people don't believe it. but I wrote down my predictions in that chapter and what the press said about it at the time. The New York Times, all of them were scornful of it. But, you know, if you really follow the truth, and truth is the high state, then you have to go there and wait for it to happen, and that's the secret.
I want to talk about